me the story of Jesus. Write on my heart every word. Tell me the story most precious, sweetest that ever was heard. Love in that story so tender, clearer than ever I see. Say, let me read while you whisper, love paid the ransom for me. Tell me the story most precious, sweetest that ever was heard.
Okay, we're going to continue on our study with Elijah. We are in 1 Kings chapter 19. We began in 1 Kings 19 last week. We looked at some of these same verses that we're going to read this morning, but we've got a little bit slightly different angle to look at on some of the same things. But they're important to look at. It's important to try to get as much out of this as you can. So in 1 Kings 19 verse 1, it says, "And Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and withal how he had slain all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger unto Elijah, saying, So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I make not thy life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. And when he saw that, he rose and went for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongeth to Judah, and left his servant there." Now last week we considered the flight of Elijah. We showed how he'd left his post. We showed how he had become fearful of this one woman and ran for his life. But this week there's something else that I want us to consider. And that is how God takes our failings and uses them for his purpose. Even when, now that does not excuse us for our failings. If we drift into sin, we will be punished for it and we will pay for it, but make no mistake about it, God uses that to bring about his purposes. It doesn't get us off the hook. But God knows everything you will do regardless of what situation you're put into. He knows which way you will go, A or B. And so he uses the way that you will go to bring about what he needs to bring about. So even when you fail him, he is still using that failure. Does that make sense? Okay, so we're going to look at a little bit of that this morning. Matthew Henry said, one would have expected. Now he's talking about a few verses earlier when Elijah brought the fire down, or prayed, and the fire came down and consumed the sacrifice and such, and he'd made the prophets of Baal look so foolish. One would have expected, after such a public and sensible manifestation of the glory of God and such a clear decision of the controversy between him and Baal, to the honor of Elijah, the confusion of Baal's prophets, and the universal satisfaction of the people, after they have seen both fire and water come from heaven at the prayer of Elijah, and both in mercy to them, the one as it signified the acceptance of their offering, the other as it refreshed their inheritance which was weary, and that they would all as one man return to the worship of the God of Israel, and take Elijah for their guide and oracle, that he would thenceforward be prime minister of state, and his directions would be as laws both to king and kingdom. But it is quite otherwise. He is neglected whom God honored. No respect is paid to him, nor care taken of him, nor any use made of him, but on the contrary, the land of Israel, to which he had been and might have been so great a blessing, is now made too hot for him. I mean, stop and think about this. Here you have a man of God that calls down fire from heaven. And, okay, they say, Jehovah, he is the God, and then go have lunch and leave Elijah to himself. You see, part and parcel of this is that God knew that Israel was not going to be converted by this. He knew that there would be no great revival in Israel as a result of this. And he also knew that Elijah, if threatened, would run for his life. And so he allowed Elijah to run for his life to get him out of Israel, to punish Israel for their apostasy. Even though they had, just like the children in the wilderness had seen God part the Red Sea, they had walked across the Red Sea on dry land. Did that change them that much? Were they not murmuring in the wilderness within 40 days while Moses was on the mountain? Did they not complain the whole time they walked around in the wilderness? You look at under Joshua's day. Joshua comes along, and what does God do with Joshua to prove that he's a man of God? He parts the Jordan River at the high period of the year. Just like he had the Red Sea, he parts it, they walk across the Jordan River on dry land. This was not some little bitty creek. It was like walking across the Mississippi River. And God stops the water and dries the land, they walk across on dry land, and one generation later, they're back into idolatry again. This is the way people go, and God knew that this was how they would go, so he allowed Elijah to run. So let's not lose sight of that also. Yes, Elijah got fearful and ran for his life, but God used that and allowed it to happen to punish the people that weren't going to have anything to do with him anyway. So his departure from Israel from the other side of the coin was a judgment against Israel. Because God saw their hearts. He knew there'd be no long-lasting revival, so he allowed his servant to leave the country. But don't forget, this does not excuse Elijah. It's just an example of how God uses even our failings. Consider the Lord Jesus Christ. The Jews could have let him go. It was their decision to crucify him. They were not predestined before the foundation of the world to crucify Christ. It was their responsibility. They could have let him go. God knew they wouldn't, and so God used that hatred in their hearts to bring about his purpose that needed to be done. It doesn't excuse them. It doesn't get them off the hook. You'll hear people say, well, they had to do it, so therefore they're guiltless. No, they're not. They did it. They could have said, let him go. But they didn't. It brought about God's purpose, and God used them to bring about his purpose. But that does not get them off the hook. But I do want you to understand that even sometimes when we fall, when we trip, when we make mistakes, God still is able to use that to bring about the purpose that he's bringing about. Now, we talk about Elijah's fear. I want you to turn to Isaiah chapter 8. In Isaiah chapter 8, and this is one of the, this is the one passage of Scripture. I don't have it in the notes actually here, but I'll read it anyway. This is the one passage of Scripture that mentions associations. It's the only place in the Bible where associations are mentioned. And in verse 9 it says, associate yourselves, O ye people, and ye shall be broken in pieces. This is one of the reasons that we are an independent church. While we fellowship with other churches, we have other churches that are sister churches that we fellowship with. We do not associate with them in the sense that there's some sort of hierarchical system. That's the reason we don't do it. The Bible says not to, and it's pretty plain about it. Most Baptist churches have fallen into the error of associating themselves together. And they do it because of the fear of being out here by themselves. That's really what it boils down to. They feel that they can be stronger if they unite with other Baptist churches in an association. They feel that they can withstand the trouble that might come their way. But if every time they do, they get splintered. Every time they associate together, they split. You end up with divisions, you end up with problems. That's the history of the Baptist church. Just go read Haskell's and you'll see it year after year after year. That's the way things have gone. But that's the reason we don't associate ourselves together. Our fear is not to be of what's outside that room. And that's the point that I want to make right now. We are not to fear that out there. We're not to be afraid of the world out there. That's not where we're supposed to be afraid. Our fear is to be of God. God can handle that. God can take care of anything that goes on out there. He has ever since He created the universe. We're not to fear that stuff. Our fear is to be in God. And if we place our fear in God, God will take care of all the rest of that. This is why God's ministers have always been able to be so bold. They don't fear that. You look at the men that were burned at the stake for the sake of the Bible and for the sake of God's ministry. Were they afraid of those men that lit the fire? No. Why would they be? Because their fear was in God and they knew God could take care of the rest. And that's what we're to take from this. Elijah lost sight of that for a moment and ran. We're not to do that. In Isaiah chapter 8 and verse 12, it says, "Say ye not a confederacy to all them to whom this people shall say a confederacy, neither fear ye their fear, nor be afraid." The reason that they were forming these confederacies was because they didn't want to stand by themselves. They were afraid to be alone. They wanted to bring others into their group because security in numbers. The more we have, the more secure we are. That's what we see out there in the world amongst Baptist churches all over the place. That's the reason that they have associations and conventions, and they want to be part of a bigger group because they're afraid to stand alone. And God says, don't be afraid of those. Don't group together because of that. Don't associate yourselves together with other churches because don't be afraid of that. Okay? Because he goes on in the very next verse, verse 13, and says, "Sanctify the Lord of hosts himself, and let him be your fear, and let him be your dread." That's who we're to fear. We're to fear God. You want to be afraid of somebody, be afraid of God. And the rest of the fear of the world will melt like butter on a hot pan. The rest of that means nothing now. Don't be afraid of that stuff out there. You look at some of the most fearless, I was a history major and I studied the Civil War. That was one of my big areas. And I've told this story before, but I'll tell it again because it's a really good story. Stonewall Jackson. Stonewall Jackson was asked by, I think it was one of the other officers at the time, how is it that you can stand there on your horse with bullets flying all around you, and he'd even been shot before sitting on his horse, and it didn't faze him. And he said, because my faith teaches me to feel as safe in battle as I am in bed. He wasn't worried. He wasn't afraid of that. He knew that when his day would come, and it wasn't his concern to be concerned with that. His concern was to be ready when it happened. That's all. And he ended that speech by saying, if all men had the same faith, then all men would be equally brave. And he's absolutely right. That's the type of men that can go into those types of situations and come out okay, that can deal with what they have to deal with. It comes from a fear of God and not a fear of men. It comes from trusting that God will take care of whatever. So that's why we're to fear God and not put our fear into men. In Jeremiah chapter 1 and verse 8, now Jeremiah was very young at the time that God spoke these words. He had just called him to be a prophet. And in Jeremiah 1:8 he says, "Be not afraid of their faces, for I am with thee to deliver thee, saith the Lord." Now there's another verse here. I don't have it in my notes. Verse 17. Thou therefore gird up thy loins and arise and speak unto them all that I command thee. Be not dismayed at their faces, lest I confound thee before them. I've experienced that one, and it's real. You start to get afraid of the people that are sitting out there in the audience, and God will turn you into a blithering idiot. I've witnessed it from here. Experienced it, as you will. We're not to be afraid of that. We're not to be afraid of the people out there. We're not to be afraid of anything other than God. And that's what we need to keep our eyes on. Think about this God that we worship. Think of what He is capable to do. Look at the stories in the Bible, which are not just stories to tell. Look at how He stopped the mouths of the lions with Daniel, or when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the fiery furnace, how they came out unsinged. Look at down through history the way that God has taken care of His people. And we're going to continue to see Him take care of Jeremiah, even though Jeremiah ran away. God will still continue to take care of him. He's one of he is one of God's children. Okay? And you remember the story when they were in the ship and they were afraid because the storm was tossed, and they came to Christ and woke him up. You remember that? And he said, "Why are you so fearful, ye of little faith?" And so he spoke to the storm, and that was the end of it. It died down. In 1 Peter chapter 3, and verse 14, we read, and if ye, is this the right verse? Yeah, and if ye suffer for righteousness' sake, happy are ye, and be not afraid of their terror, neither be ye troubled. Talking about some of the persecutions that come upon the earth. This is a message that we're required to take to heart. There's no need to be afraid of what man can do to you. No need whatsoever. You should fear what God can do to you. Now, in our story here of Elijah, when we're told that he, in verse 3 of 1 Kings 19, when he saw that, he arose and went for his life and came to Beersheba, which belonged to Judah, and left his servant there. Beersheba was in the very south part of Judah. Remember, he was in Israel. We talked about this way back in the beginning, where the kingdoms were divided, and the northern kingdom was Israel, the southern kingdom was Judah. And he was up in Samaria, or near there, when he first started to run. Beersheba is in the southern part of Judah. So he's 90 miles. He's traveled roughly 90 miles away from Jezreel. So that's quite a ways to run. But he's about 90. You would think he's safe at this point, right? He's outside of the country. He's 90 miles away. You would think that, okay, well, that's probably good enough. He's probably safe. But not really. Because in reality, by going going to Beersheba, he's basically jumped out of the fire out of the frying pan into the fire. And the reason is because, turn to 2 Kings chapter 18 and I'll show you. We're going to read about Jehoshaphat's son. Jehoshaphat was at this time the king of Judah. Ahab was the king of Israel. Jehoshaphat was the king of Judah. And in 2 Kings chapter 8 and verse 18, it says, "And he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel." This is the son of Jehoshaphat. "He walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, as did the house of Ahab, for the daughter of Ahab was his wife. and he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Jehoshaphat's son had married Ahab's wife, or Ahab's daughter. The daughter of Ahab and Jezebel was the queen of Judah after the days of Jehoshaphat. So Elijah's running to Judah is not going to help him. As soon as Jehoshaphat finds out where he is, do you not think he'll turn him over to Ahab? This is the same Jehoshaphat in 1 Kings chapter 22, when Ahab wanted to go to war against Ramoth Gilead. 1 Kings 22:4, it says, "And he said unto Jehoshaphat, Wilt thou go with me to battle in Ramoth Gilead? And Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, I am as thou art, my people is thy people, my horses as thy horses." They were one and the same. So Elijah wasn't safe yet. Even though he'd run 90 miles, he's still not safe. And so we read in 1 Kings 19:4, "But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness." So he's run about 90 miles, and now he's leaving to go into the middle of the desert, the middle of the wilderness. Now, having come from the West, I know what it's like to be out in the middle of the wilderness. We have deserts out there. And you can just go out there and die. You get out in the middle of the desert, there's nothing there. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. If you're lucky, you'll find a Joshua tree. Or maybe one little bush. But there's really, I guess there's some wildlife out there, but none that you want to play with. It's not pretty, and that's where Elijah went. He went a day into the wilderness. And to finish verse 4, it says, "But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree." I want you to think about this. One of the consequences of fear and unbelief is a restless soul. Jesus said in one place, "Come unto me and I will give you rest." When you go away from him, you lose the rest. You become fearful. You lose your mind. I cannot tell you the number of people that have given up on the church that have experienced this kind of a thing. They walk away and then they lose their minds. And you see it. We have people that were friends of ours that have walked away, and now they become blithering idiots. They lose it all. Isaiah 57:20 said, "But the wicked are like the troubled sea when it cannot rest, whose waters cast up mire and dirt." They're troubled. And you can probably remember times in your life when you were troubled, when things just didn't seem to add up. And you went from one to another and one to another, and if you ever turn around and go back the other way, the same thing will happen to you. If you're at rest now as a result of being in the church, if you were to leave the church, you would go right back into the same trouble. It doesn't matter if you're born again or not. This is that part of that salvation that we talk about all the time. That feeling that you're in the right place, the feeling that you're in communion with God. That goes away if you turn around and run. In Romans chapter 3 and verse 17, Paul said, in referring to wicked, he said, "In the way of peace they have not known." So when the Christian's out of fellowship with God, when he takes matters into his own hands, when faith and hope are no longer in existence, his case is no better than that of the unregenerate. For he's cut himself off from the comforts and from the comforts of God and from the communion of God. He's cut himself off from it. And instead of being in rest and comfortable, his mind's in turmoil, just like Elijah's. And unfortunately, most people nowadays they start to seek to find relief in a senseless round of diversions, and they try this and they try that and they try everything else under the sun when all they really had to do was stay in the church. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree, and he requested for himself that he might die. Now I'm going to prove the point. Why did he run away from Jezebel? Because she threatened to take his life away. Now he's sitting under a juniper tree wishing he would die. Why didn't he just stay in Jezreel and she would have taken care of it for him? You see the point? You lose your mind. When you walk away from God, you lose your mind. He runs away because he doesn't want to lose his life, and now he's begging for God to take it. What's the point? But that's the way it happens. In Luke chapter 15 and verse 17, talking about the prodigal son had run off, had spent all of his inheritance, and it says in Luke 15:17, and when he came to himself, when he finally woke up, when he came back to starting thinking right again, he said, how many hired servants of my father have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? When he came to himself. We're told in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 7, for God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. One of the things that you get when you're born again, and especially when you're converted and become a member of the church, you get a sound mind. You get to where you can think again. You get to where you can think right. In Luke chapter 8 and verse 35, it says, then they went out to see what was done. This was the man that had been possessed by a legion of devils. And it's talking about the apostles. When they went out to see what was done and came to Jesus and found the man out of whom the devils were departed sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind. You see, he'd gotten his mind back. Elijah lost his. And now he's running for his life under a juniper tree, begging God to take his life when he was running for his life to begin with. Now, I know I'm sounding critical right now, and I'm going to turn the tide on this in a second. In 1 Kings 19:4, but he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came down and sat under a juniper tree, and he requested for himself that he might die. I can say here without fear of contradiction, because I've spoken to enough men and I know from my own personal experience, that Elijah is not the only servant of the Lord that's ever wished that he could shuffle off this mortal coil. He's not alone. I would venture a guess that most, if not all, of God's servants at one time or another have requested for themselves that they might die. Especially at times when it appears that there's so little fruit. When the days turn into weeks, and the weeks into months, and the months into years, and the years into decades, and it looks like they're not doing anything but beating their head against a wall because it feels so good when they finally quit. There are times when just about all of them have requested that they, like Elijah, that they could just get me out of here. In Numbers chapter 11 and verse 14, we have the story of Moses. And if anybody was truly a man of God, you would think it was Moses. Moses had the evidence, a lot more evidence than men today have. I mean, I don't know anybody that's truly parted the Red Sea or done some of the things that Moses has done. And yet Moses chapter 11 and verse 14, he says, I am not able to bear all this people alone because it is too heavy for me. And if thou deal thus with me, kill me, I pray thee, out of hand, if I have found favor in thy sight, and let me not see my wretchedness. Even Moses had gotten to the point to where he was ready to get out of here. He'd had enough. He couldn't handle it anymore. Jonah, in Jonah chapter 4, And this is interesting. We don't have time to really look at Jonah, but this is after Jonah had had success in Nineveh, after he had preached and the people had repented, not before he ran away and got swallowed by a fish. This was after he had success. And in Jonah chapter 4 and verse 3, it says, "Therefore now, O Lord, take, I beseech thee, my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live." This was after the success that he had. David said in Psalm 55:6, "And I said, oh, that I had wings like a dove, for then I would fly away and be at rest." So Elijah was not the only minister, if you will, that had ever gone through this. Even though our time down here is short, there are times when it feels excruciatingly long. And sometimes you just can't bear it. And it's not just ministers, even God's children sometimes that aren't ministers, it hit that point. They hit the wall and start wishing that God would just take them out of here. They've had enough. They've paid enough. If you haven't had it yet, you probably will. So let this be warning. It happens to all of us. Now, this doesn't vindicate Elijah running away and saying it, and it doesn't vindicate any of us from doing it either. But it is a fact that it happens. It is a fact that there are times when the persecution is hitting that you just want it over with. And if that means get me out of here, then get me out of here. And so, even though I'm not proud of it, there have been a number of times that I, like Elijah, have sat under that same juniper tree and have said the same words. So while I can't give, on the one hand, I can see how it's wrong, but I can also sympathize. And some of you may, if you haven't been there, you may be there someday. And when you do, you go back and read the story of Elijah, because this is the part that you need to see. There's a couple of things, though. It needs to be pointed out that there's a difference between wanting to be out of here because of persecution or suffering and wanting to do what the Apostle Paul wanted. Turn to Philippians chapter 1. The Apostle Paul was eager to get out of here as well, but it was for a little bit different reason. The reason of Elijah was because of what he was going through. Paul says, in Philippians chapter 1, verse 21, "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I live in the flesh, this is the fruit of my labor, yet what I choose I wot not. For I'm astrait betwixt two, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better." Paul could see that being out of here was better than being here. In other words, don't take all your stock in what's around here in the earth, in the world. This isn't the good part. This is what we have to go through to get to the good part, but this isn't the good part. So don't lay up all your treasures here. Don't put all of your heart and soul here, because this is not the end-all be-all. We're to build our treasures in heaven. What was it that Christ said? That where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Paul says, "For I'm in a strait betwixt two, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to abide in the flesh is more needful for you. And having this confidence, I know that I shall abide and continue with you, all for your furtherance and joy of faith, that your rejoicing may be more abundant in Jesus Christ for me by my coming to you again." So Paul's position was it would be better to go to Christ, but the church needs me. Elijah had lost sight of that. He'd lost sight of the fact that Israel needed him. He'd lost sight of the fact that God still had something for him to do. And that's where the failing comes. Where Paul could wish that he could go on to be in heaven, he realized that there was still something for him to do. And so he'll wait. It's more needful for him to stay. That's the part that Elijah had lost sight of. There's another point here. Even though Elijah was despondent, and even though he had wished for God to take his life, he didn't do anything about it. He didn't take matters into his own hands. And he still asked God to do it. There's a big difference there. We read about people from time to time that just to reach the point where they not only do they not ask God to do it, they do it themselves. They take matters into their own hands. Elijah didn't do that, but it wouldn't have bothered him much had God decided to take him. Our good friend Pink had this to say: no matter how cast down we be, how acute our grief, it is ever the privilege of the believer to unburden his heart unto the one who sticketh closer than a brother, and pour out our complaint into his sympathetic ear. He will not wink at what is wrong, nevertheless, he is touched with the feelings of our infirmities. True, he will not always grant us our request, for oftentimes we ask amiss. Yet if he withholds what we desire, it is because he has something better for us. Thus it was in the case of Elijah. The Lord did not take away his life from him at that time. He did not do so later. For Elijah was taken to heaven without seeing death. Elijah is one of only two who have entered heaven without passing through the portals of the grave. Nevertheless, for God's chariot, Elijah had to wait God's appointed time. You see, Elijah, here he prays to die. He never did. He never did die. There's some of the people that believe in reincarnation will take they'll take the fact that John the Baptist was referred to as being Elijah, and they'll say, well, see, that proves reincarnation because John the Baptist was the spirit of Elijah, and so that proves the idea that you die and then you come back as somebody else. Well, it doesn't work though, because Elijah never died, so it doesn't prove reincarnation. So Elijah says in 1 Kings 19:4, "It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers." He was tired of the ceaseless opposition. He was tired of the weary, of the strife, of all that he'd encountered, disheartened of his labors, which he felt were of no avail. Like Peter, he felt as though the work brought nothing. You remember there was a time when Christ told them to let the nets down and they'd catch a lot of fish. And Peter said, "Master, we've toiled all the night and have taken nothing." The difference between Peter and Elijah, though, was what Peter said immediately after that. Because he said, "Nevertheless, at thy word, I'll let down the net." And he took a bunch of fish. So here again we see the consequences of giving way to fear and unbelief. Elijah was now in the pit of darkness, which most of God's children go to at one time or another. So many of you have only been Christians for a couple of years. Trust me, there will come a time, if there hasn't already, that you will enter that pit. You will get to, maybe not a point that far, but you will get to that point where things look dark. Elijah had forsaken the place into which the Lord had brought him, and he now tasted the bitter effects of a course of self-will. And this is what happens to all of us if we go there. If we stop looking at God and start looking at self, if we take our own feelings ahead of what God has for us, this is where we go. We end up in the wilderness under a juniper tree, asking God to take our life. All pleasure was gone out of his life. The joy of the Lord was no longer his strength. And when we depart from the path of duty, it's just like taking a rod and beating ourselves on the back with it. It's not him doing it to us. A lot of times we do it to ourselves. A lot of the problems we go through is because of our own selves. And so he says, "It's enough now, take away my life, for I'm not better than my fathers." Now, I'm not exactly sure what that means. I'm not better than my fathers, so I'm not going to comment on it. But I want you to notice the Lord's response. because this is very telling, and this gives us hope. Because Elijah was a man unto like passions, just like we are. He was human. He failed. And now it's important to see what God's response was to this failure. He didn't turn with disgust and leave his erring servant to reap the rewards of his lack of faith. He didn't do that. But you wouldn't expect him to. Shall the good shepherd refuse to take care of one of his strayed sheep? Have you ever known him to do that? Shall the great physician refuse assistance to one of his patients just when he needs him the most? In 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 9, it says, "The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering to usward, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance." That term, usward, Elijah falls into that group of usward. He was one of the usward. God is long-suffering to his elect. He is long-suffering to them. He bears with us more than we could ever imagine. Not willing that any of us die here, but that he eventually turns us to repentance, which is what he's doing with Elijah. Psalms 103:13 says, "Like a father pitieth his children, so the Lord pitieth them that fear him." And Elijah was one of them. He provided for this wayward sheep by giving him rest and by taking care of him. Even though he'd run away, God was still there to take care of him, to provide for him, because God wasn't finished with him yet. In 1 Kings 19:5 it says, "And he lay and slept under a juniper tree." Now, a lot of people might not take that to mean much. You know, he traveled a long way, so yeah, he's probably tired. But there's more to see there than just that one little word, slept. In Psalm 127 and verse 2, it says, "It is vain for you to rise up early, to sit up late, to eat the bread of sorrows, for so he giveth his beloved sleep." Turn over to 1 Samuel chapter 26. This is something that a lot of times we don't give enough credence to this. We don't consider that that's where sleep comes from. And we're going to read about a case where, well, we know, we're going to read in 1 Samuel about the time when David was snuck up on Saul. I want you to remember with Adam, God brought upon him a deep sleep when he took the rib and made Eve. Well, look what it says here in 1 Samuel 26. It says, "For David took this..." Now, David had the opportunity to kill Saul, and he didn't do it here. He snuck up on him while they were asleep in the camp. "So David took the spear and the cruse of water from Saul's bolster, and they gat them away, and no man saw it nor knew it, neither awakened, for they were all asleep, because a deep sleep from the Lord was fallen upon them." How often is it lost sight of that God is where we get sleep? He cares for the bodies of his children just as much as he cares for their souls. Now, we recognize this when it comes to food and clothing and shelter and things like that, and we generally thank him for that. But how often do we thank him for sleep? Toss and turn for a few nights in a row, and maybe you'll start thanking God for sleep. Because that's where it comes from. It's imperative to our physical well-being as food and drink. And one is as much the gift of our Heavenly Father as the other. We can't put ourselves to sleep. Have you ever tried it? Have you ever had your mind racing and you just know you got to get to sleep and try to put yourself to sleep? Have you ever done that? It's impossible to do. it only makes matters worse. You can't work yourself to sleep. You can work yourself until you're just absolutely exhausted with physical labor, and then you're too tired to sleep. So remember, sleep comes from God, and God gave Elijah sleep. Can you imagine how troubled his mind had to be when he had run? He's got to be physically exhausted by this time, and all he can see in his mind is Jezebel chasing him down. And so God gives him sleep. And God can do the exact opposite. David said in Psalm 77:4, "Thou holdest mine eyes waking. I am so troubled that I cannot speak." So God can trouble you. Paul used to talk about it. Day by day the Lord feeds us. Night by night he giveth his beloved sleep. And in this little detail of Elijah sleeping under the juniper tree, we don't want to pass over it too lightly. We want to look at the gracious hand of God involved in this. And why would God worry about this? Why would he take care of us this way? Remember we read that verse over in Proverbs that the Lord pitieth them that fear him? And the reason is found in Psalm chapter 103 and verse 14. Psalms 103 and verse 14. "For he knoweth our frame, he remembereth that we are dust." He knows that we're just dirt. And so he's mindful of our frailty, and he tempers his winds accordingly. He's aware when our energies are spent, and he graciously renews our strength, as he did with Elijah under the juniper tree. And we looked at 2 Peter 3:9 that he's long-suffering, and that included Elijah. He was long-suffering toward Elijah. Elijah had run and deserted him, and yet he was right there to make sure that he got sleep. It was not God's design that his servant should die of exhaustion in the wilderness after this long flight. He's out in the middle of the desert. So he mercifully refreshes his body with sleep, and he compassionately deals with us in the same way, even though we don't see it. And it's such a shame that we do not recognize this and how little we're affected by the Lord's goodness and grace to us. Many of his gracious mercies are given on such a regular basis that we're just inclined to take them for granted. We don't consider it. It happens all the time. We sleep every night. Until we reach the point that we can't. This is one of the reasons that a lot of people don't take care of their health until it's too late. Because why? It's always here until it's not. And unfortunately, when we do get to a point where we spend nights tossing and turning and we can't sleep, instead of repenting of our former ingratitude and humbly confessing the same to God, we end up murmuring and complaining and griping and moaning because we haven't been able to sleep. Don't ever lose sight of the fact that sleep comes from God, and thank him for it. Now let's look at another aspect of this. I want you to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13. There hath no temptation taken you but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that which you are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it. Now let's look at the first part of this verse. There had no temptation taken but such as is common to man. The trials and tribulations that we go through are no more than anyone else has ever had to deal with. We may think they are, but they're not. Anything that you've ever gone through, there's someone in this Bible that went through worse in the same situation. You can never find something that you have to deal with that you can't find somebody in this Bible that had to deal with so much worse than what you have to deal with. I want you to turn to Job chapter 1. Some people moan and complain because they've fallen into financial straits, or they've lost a loved one, and they don't understand why, and they wonder, why would God make me go through something like this? Let's look at Job. Job chapter 1, verse 13. And there was a day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And there came a messenger unto Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the asses feeding beside them, and the Sabellians fell upon them and took them away. Yea, they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. While he was yet speaking, there came also another, and said, the fire of God is fallen from heaven, and hath burned up the sheep and the servants, and consumed them, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. And while he was yet speaking, there came also another, and said, the Chaldeans made out 3 bands, and fell upon the camels, and have carried them away, yea, and slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. And while he was yet speaking, there came also another, and said, thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness, and smote the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men, and they are dead, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. Then Job arose and rent his mantle, and shaved his head, and fell down upon the ground, and worshipped, and said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Could you do that? If you lost everything you had, including your children, could you fall down on your knees and worship and say, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away, blessed be the name of the Lord? Job did. Have you had to go through anything like that? I don't think so. We might go through trials and tribulations, but we haven't gone through that. Look at Job chapter 2 and verse 7. So went Satan forth from the presence of the Lord, and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot unto his crown. And he took him a potsherd to scrape himself withal, and he sat down among the ashes. Can you imagine that? Sore boils from the bottom of your foot to the crown, to your forehead, covered with these putrefying sores. Can you imagine that? No one's gone in this room has gone through that. I don't know anybody that's ever gone through that. I've known people that have gone through some stuff, but I've never known anybody to go through anything like that before. So if you have health issues, well, Job had health issues, and he didn't curse God. Turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. There's a place over in Romans where Paul mentions that the tribulations of this present time are not to be compared with the glory that we will have in heaven. Well, let's look at some of his. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 24. If you're ever feeling like you've been persecuted as a result of the gospel, let's take a look at that. Let's see if you've suffered as Paul had. Verse 24. Of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one. Thrice was I beaten with rods. Once was I stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day have I been in the deep. in journeyings often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils by mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often. That means he couldn't sleep. In hunger and thirst, in fasting often, in times he couldn't eat, in cold and nakedness, besides those things that are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. None of us have been persecuted like that. None of us have had to go through that. And none of us probably will. But there's another side of this. Perhaps that which overwhelms some is the shame they feel over the breakdown. Remember, I told you, there are times when every one of us falls apart, when we lose faith. And this is the one that gets you the worst. Sometimes it's not the persecution that you've dealt with, it's the shame you feel for breaking so easily, for losing it so easily, for thinking that you were strong, for thinking that I can get through this, and then falling apart and breaking. And that's something that we all have to deal with. Knowing that others have been tried as severely as you have, and yet, in fact, more severely, and yet they handled it with composure, and you completely fell apart. Instead of drawing comfort from the divine promises, give way to a spirit of despair, like Elijah did, and run away. Instead of plodding along the path of duty, desert it, like Elijah did, and run to the wilderness. Thinking, was there ever such a sorry failure as I am? Many of us have been there over the course of our Christian lives. Unfortunately, many of us will be there again. And so it's important that we understand where God stands when this happens, that as long as we still don't completely run away, and as long as God's not finished with us, then God's not finished with us. It's true that we should be humbled, and we should mourn over these types of failures. And these are things that we should contritely confess before God, but we can't imagine that all is now lost. Because even this experience, even though it's not unparalleled in the lives of others, look at Job. Look what happened to Job. Even though he didn't curse God, he did curse the day he was born. He broke too. So even Job broke the same way that many of us break. Jeremiah did as well. In Jeremiah chapter 20 and verse 14, he said, "Cursed be the day wherein I was born." So it happens to all of us. And when it happens, and when that shame overshadows you, you need to remember that God's still there. God was still there for Elijah. God will still be there for you. Repent of it and move on. Get past it and move on. Now there's another part of this in 1 Corinthians 10:13 that we were looking at. It says, "Hath no temptation taken you but such as common to man?" Look at this next part. "But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it." It's important to note, even if we are faithless, God is faithful. We've looked at the verses already in places where it says that God cannot deny himself. In Romans chapter 3, in verse 3, Paul says, "For what if some did not believe? shall their unbelief make the faith of God without effect? Just because man doesn't believe, is that going to make God lose faith? Of course not. He goes on to say, God forbid, let God be true, but every man a liar. God's true to his covenant, just as we're told in the Psalms. In Psalm chapter 89, David wrote this psalm. And more people should pay attention to this one, especially those that are of the nature that feel that you can be saved today and lost tomorrow. They should pay attention to this. Psalm 89 and verse 32 says, then will I visit their transgressions with a rod. Yeah, you get out of the way, you're apt to get spanked. And their iniquity with stripes. He will chastise you. Nevertheless, my loving kindness will I not utterly take from him, nor suffer my faithfulness to fail. If you're one of his children and you get out of the way, you may go through some trouble. Elijah went through some trouble, as we're going to see as we continue this study. But God never turned his back on him. God never let him fall. God never let go of him. God ended up taking him back into heaven in a chariot. God knows our frame. He will not suffer us to be unduly tried, but he will with the temptation also make a way to escape. That is to say, he'll either lighten the burden or he'll give increased strength to bear it, so we won't be totally overwhelmed by it. God's faithful. That does not mean that if we deliberately jump at temptations, he'll necessarily hold us up. But if we seek to resist temptations, if we call upon him in the day of trouble, if we plead his promises and count on him to see us through, he will most certainly not fail us. Now consider 1 Corinthians 10:13 in the light of this prophet Elijah. How strikingly it's illustrated and exemplified in the life of this prophet. After all of Elijah's fidelity in the Lord's service, it was a sore trial indeed to be threatened by the Queen of Israel. When all his efforts to bring Israel back to the worship of the true God seemed to be utterly in vain, this was simply too much for the prophet to bear. He was weary of such a one-sided and losing fight, and he prayed to be removed from further service to the cause. But God was faithful. And even though the temptation came, God made a way for him to escape. And escape he did. God did not remove the burden. And you may find this in your life, that when temptation comes, he may not remove the burden. But he gives fresh supplies of grace so that you can withstand and get through the burden. God didn't take Jezebel out of the way. He didn't change the hearts of the people of the nation of Israel. But he renewed the strength of his prophet. He gave him sleep under the juniper tree. And we're going to see more as we continue the study. So though Elijah had fled from his post of duty, the Lord did not now desert the prophet in his hour of need. God was right there by him. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 13 says, if we believe not, yet he abideth faithful. He cannot deny himself. If you're one of his children, he cannot deny himself. You see, God is not some fair-weathered friend, but he's the one that shed his own blood to redeem you. Proverbs 17:17 says, a friend loveth at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. As the Apostle Paul said over in Hebrews chapter 13, quoting from the book of Joshua, he said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. And that's something that we have to take heart to. And by looking at this prophet Elijah, even though he had run away, God didn't leave or forsake him. God was right there. And Paul goes on in that verse to say, the Lord is my helper, and I will not fear what man shall do unto me. And that's the lesson that we need to learn and take out of the room with us. Regardless of what goes on out there, your fear should be of God. God will take care of you. Even if you're in the middle of the wilderness underneath a juniper tree, God will take care of you. And we're going to see how he continues to take care of this prophet when we come back next week. Because it wasn't just sleep that he gave him. And we will see how he was once again provided him with sustenance to get him through his failing times. And so for this week, we'll leave the prophet Elijah asleep under the juniper tree, and we'll pick up here again next week, Lord willing. So let's stand and prepare for the communion service.